speakers are ready. I'm not sure everybody's here yet, but I think most are, but I think therefore that we should start. I'm very happy to welcome our panel. Do feel free to sit down. Peter Lawrence is going to speak first. He was also a lecturer at the University of Dar es Salaam Department of Economics, but before my time, so we didn't actually overlap there. But I followed his work, not least on the sisal industry, but on other industrial strategy in Tanzania ever since. So it's a great pleasure to have Peter with us.
Thanks very much to David in particular for inviting me, and all the sentiments that have been expressed by everybody, by all the geriatrics yesterday I endorse fully. It's great to be able to contribute. As Brian told a nice story yesterday about how the sisal industry was nationalised, and my connection with Tanzania goes back to 1968, when I arrived as a research student from Leeds University to do my field work on the very sisal industry that had been nationalised. I could say lots about that, but I'm not going to talk about that, except to say that it was called the sisal industry. And the only thing that made it an industry was that every sisal estate had what was called a factory, where the fibre was stripped from the leaf in order to export sisal fibre. And because that involved a very large machine called a decorticator, it was called a factory and it was called an industry. And in doing the work that I've been doing on industrialization in Africa, there is an issue of terminology, because as was mentioned yesterday, the general development ideas around in the 1960s, 1970s were the development particularly of manufacturing. Manufacturing being a section of industry that would allow for very rapid increases in productivity, very rapid growth, much faster than agriculture or even than extractive industry. So the interest is the interest that I have recently developed is really in manufacturing, and why the manufacturing structure of Sub-Saharan, or in fact I've covered the whole of Africa, is as it is. And so that's really what I'm going to address in doing a little bit of comparison between Tanzania and the rest of Africa. There is a paper, but it's not the paper for this topic. But it's a paper that I've done I wrote back in the mid-2000s, was published in Development and Change, on industrialization in Africa, and I'm now updating that for a volume that is going to be edited by John Weiss and Mike Tribe, and in updating, I have been rather saddened that the changes that I expected to find, even in that 10-year period, have not really occurred. So when I was asked if I could give a paper, I said, well, I can do a paper on comparing Tanzania with the rest of Africa, because I can take Tanzania out of the study that I've done and make that kind of comparison. So in that sense, this is a different paper. It's a comparative paper, and I don't have that paper written. In fact, as somebody said yesterday, I don't have to quote somebody, I don't have that paper started. But I did actually do a little bit of work on the data. And so what you have in front of you is an attempt to compare various indicators, Tanzania and the rest of Africa. And I've divided up the rest of Africa broadly into the economic unions that exist. There are lots of overlapping economic unions, as we know, so I've kind of cheated a bit and to ensure that the same countries don't appear in all the, or that some countries don't appear in more than one group. And then I've tracked Tanzania. And I've done that since the beginning of the 1970s, and that's largely determined by the data that is available, the data runs that are available. And this comes out of the World Bank's development indicators, the data bank, as it's now called. So the light blue line is Tanzania, and the heavy blue line is the East African Community, which includes Tanzania. I haven't taken Tanzania out of that, which maybe I should have done. So there you can see that this is the shares of manufacturing in GDP, and they go up to just over 20% at one point in northeast of Africa, which includes Ethiopia and Egypt in this context. And these are weighted, by the way, so weighted by population. And so you can see that Tanzania is somewhere in the middle, somewhere towards the 10% share of manufacturing. Now, let's see if this works. There should be. Oh, maybe a page down. Nope. It's very strange. How do I go to the next slide? Oh, right. This is the share in manufacturing exports, the share of total exports. Now the Tanzanian data, I'm not sure that I entirely believe it, but that's what it says. So there's been a massive increase in the 2000s. There's gap in these are gaps in the data, but if you look from the mid 2000s to now, you have between 60 and 70%, which is much more than anybody else. Now this is where we come back to the definition of manufacturing, because it looks as though because any kind of minor processing of export commodities becomes manufacturing, it's very likely that the upsurge in exports of gold and other raw materials which have minimal processing now count as manufactures and count in manufacturing exports. So this raises the whole question of what we mean by manufacturing. And what I mean by manufacturing is a bit more than that. Is a lot more value added. Most of the value added in manufacturing being actually done within the country, and not most of the value added in manufacturing taking place elsewhere. So this is, of course, this looks really great, but it isn't as great as it looks. And then we look at manufacturing growth rates, and that's a really pretty picture, and which would require a bit more disentangling. But you see that Tanzania is here, and you can follow that around. And these growth rates move up and down quite a lot. There's a lot of negative growth going on in the 1980s, and then it seems to recover. We're moving above zero after 2000 or so. So in the last few years, and you can see in the last few years that Tanzania's manufacturing growth has risen very, very sharply. But again, that needs to be tempered by the issue of what we mean by manufacturing. But compared with the rest of Africa, Tanzania is there, and in fact is up at the higher end as we get more towards the present. And then here's another. This is about structure of manufacturing. Again, one of the ways of measuring structure of manufacturing is looking at the proportions of manufacturing value added that come from various sectors. And in an ideal world of manufacturing, you think of machinery and textile equipment, machinery and transport equipment, which is what MTE is, and you see that line is very much down the bottom. These are what we would normally call, or another word for capital goods, machines that make machines, or machines that make goods, and we see that the proportion of value added in manufacturing that comes from that sector is very, very low, and that you would expect a lot more improvement in that proportion as you move through time, and as you can see, moving from the 1990s, for which I could only find that kind of data run, but I'm sure there is data going back further. These proportions are very small.
About 5 more minutes.
Okay, yeah. And if we're looking at what does really well, this is food, beverages, and tobacco. So the production of food, beverages, and tobacco has been the largest share of manufacturing output, and has been an increasing share of manufacturing output in Tanzania. This is Tanzania, and this is the rest of Africa, and that's just the crude average. Okay, so all that is to say that if we're looking at comparisons, then those are the kind of comparisons we get. We only started at 9:10, didn't we? Andrew. No. Okay. Implacable chair. Right. Well, what I was then going to do was to look at various explanations of why manufacturing has developed in the way that it has developed, and why there seems to have been very kind of overall not a very optimistic, a very pessimistic kind of picture. Why we haven't had a much faster development of manufacturing sector in Africa. And there are lots of explanations. In the paper that I did, there's a whole list of explanations, about 7 or 8 of them. I'll just quickly run through the list, as it were, and we can, obviously, there's going to be more specifically on manufacturing in Tanzania. But let me look at this list. And we start with import substitution industrialization as being the reason why the manufacturing hasn't developed in the ways that you might expect. And I won't go into the detail of ISI because we've all been through that, and we all know about that. But essentially, there is the whole issue of the way that industrial development took place. Then secondly, we have structural adjustment programs, and the structural adjustment programs associated with the concept of deindustrialization in Africa, which people started talking about back in the late 1980s, 1990s, using a term that was largely been applied to the developed world, or some countries in the developed world. We start talking about deindustrialization in a continent where there hasn't been an awful lot of industrialization. So lots of factories get closed as a consequence of adherence to structural adjustment programs throughout the continent, and we know that's the case also when they eventually get adopted in Tanzania. The costs of doing business is now considered to be one of the major reasons why you have a slow uptake of industrialization or manufacturing in Africa. And again, that's all to do with bureaucracy, with legal issues, with customs, and barriers and all of this kind of thing. And that's been looked at and you can find data now on the length of time it takes to get a contract finished and all this kind of stuff. And then one of the major issues, and that's come out of some of the work that the Oxford guys have done, is on the issue of wages and whether African wages are too high relative to productivity and relative to other parts of the world, and particularly Asia. And so that is another area that I go into. And again, the evidence, and then there is a question of credit shortage, of credit barriers, of credit constraints, not being able to borrow, and that relates to the development of the financial sector. And the point, of course, is that the financial sector is relatively undeveloped and needs to be more developed, and we all know what that means. And then that will enable people to be able to borrow for industrial development. And then the whole issue of producing for, unlike the import substitution model, producing for export. And part of the argument has been there's not been enough orientation towards exports. For all of those arguments, the evidence is very mixed on all of those things, and I do effectively what is a review of the research, and again that suggests that none of those explanations really hold water, certainly not in all of the cases. But what we're left with is that in all the cases, what we don't have is a very, very clear industrial strategies ever being developed in anywhere, really. And the various ideas about industrial strategies to develop being rather, not in fact being adopted or implemented. So the Clive Thomas idea of developing basic industry, in which each industries are effectively markets for each other's products. The issue of having a planned industrialization in which it's very, very clear how the different branches of industry relate to each other and why you invest in one particular area because there's need for that investment elsewhere in order to produce something else. So the old idea of going back to input-output tables is another one of those areas that got left behind, as it were, and goes back to some of the old development economics. And then there's the role of the state, and again the jury is out on the role of the state because it's a question of what role for the state. Now, to suggest that the rolling back of the state was never really a rolling back of the state, it was a change of what the state actually did. And there's a lot of evidence. Hazel Gray has a very nice piece in a recent review of African political economy where she looks at the whole business of the political settlement and also looks at the issues of whether the state, whether it's an issue of state or private, or whether it's an issue of what kind of state. And different kinds of states do different kinds of things, and so that's another area that I will cover in the paper. Well, my minute is up, and thank you very much for listening.
Good morning. My name is Ronak Olfati. I'm doing this presentation on behalf of Dr. Hossein Jalilian and Professor John Weiss. The topic that I want to talk about is competitiveness in African manufacturing includes evidence from Tanzania. In this presentation, I will start with the significance of manufacturing, then I will talk about manufacturing in Africa, and in the last part, I will analyze the data that was gathered. Now you may know that there is a long tradition in economies which argues that the manufacturing industry is a critical component in a country's economy, particularly at relatively in low and relatively countries with low income per capita. This is the engine of growth argument, which rests on several features. As you can see here, first of all, manufacturing is the sector where there is a great scope for production specialization as output grows. Secondly, is that its linkages with other parts of the economy are greater than for any other aggregate sector. Also, as a key tradable sector, manufacturing allows access to the world market and faces better demand prospect there than primary export. Manufacturers are amongst the highest productivity goods, and an increase in the share of manufacture in exports would normally be expected to raise the sophistication of overall export basket. And high export sophistication is one of the explanations for China's sustained high growth rate. Importantly, manufacturing appears to be the only sector where there is a systematic tendency for productivity to catch up with international best practice independently of policy environment in an economy. Thus, a shift in economic structure in favor of manufacturing has been found to be associated with more rapid economic growth. Here I will start with Carlos' law. As you can see, it says overall productivity growth in an economy is associated positively with the growth of manufacturing and negatively with the size of non-manufacturing employment. This is the test. As you can see, G refers to growth, VA is value added, L refers to employment, M is manufacturing, and N is non-manufacturing sector. In 2005, manufacturing was 9% of GDP in Ghana, 30% of GDP in middle-income economy like Malaysia, an average of 60% in OECD countries. However, across all countries, the relationship between a country's income per capita and the share of manufacturing in GDP has been weakening. Where manufacturing is the driver of growth, B should be positive and significant. Also, we looked throughout labor productivity convergence. CG here is the component of growth, and for the first formula is unconditional convergence, and the second one is conditional convergence. The concern here is on the sign, size, significance of convergence coefficient, and how far different between sectors, since this will indicate the scope for catch-up productivity gains within the different sectors. For unconditional convergence to be held, beta should be negative and significant. We looked throughout 38 countries. All of them were high income per capita countries, and we found that Sub-Saharan Africa behaves differently from the rest of countries. There is no statistically significant relationship between the growth of labor productivity and its initial level. And the side of the parameter estimated for agriculture and manufacturing are positive, which goes against the convergence. Unconditional convergence is not confirmed for any of the productivity sectors that we looked through. And dummy for African countries is negative, indication of being outliers. And for conditional convergence, the second formula, in non-African sample, once we control for institutional quality, convergence is faster and more significant in manufacturing than in public utilities. I just mentioned that we looked in Africa as an outlier, and the relatively low share of manufacturing in both GDP and total export in Sub-Saharan Africa is well known. And it can be explained through different channels. For example, low labor to land ratio gives African economies comparative advantages in resource-intensive goods, high labor costs relative to average incomes, lack of a skills base, poor infrastructure and business environment, Dutchess disease effects, lack of convergence and weak institutions, and undeveloped financial markets. This is a very intensive list, and I won't go to details. But if we look through this table, The table summarizes data on annual labor cost per worker and annual value added per worker. Because of the productivity differentials, despite higher wages, labor costs are not significantly different in Africa as compared to its low-income competitor economies. The interpretation can place on this result is that the key to understand Africa's failure to break into export markets for manufacturing lies not on its wages or labor productivity levels, but in indirect costs linked with transport, power, communication, security, and informal payment. This means the lack of appropriate institution is responsible for Africa's failure to break into export market for manufacturing goods. Now in this table, it gives data on wages in number of East Africa economies relative to those in China and Vietnam. As you can see, Tanzania emerged as having the highest wages of the three African economies, with wages well above those of Ethiopia, yet African wages are well below the level of wages in China. For Tanzania, apart from the wheat processing, wages are less than half of the Chinese level. If you look through this table, it shows the productivity levels of African countries in comparison with Vietnam and China. As you can see, Tanzania has the highest labor productivity of the African firms in wheat processing and casual leather shoes. In both of these goods, its productivity is higher than in China. Hence, in relation to Tanzania competitiveness, in terms of relative wages and productivity, the picture appears kind of mixed. And if I want to come to a conclusion for African competitiveness, I would say the advantage of low wage costs is offset by a combination of lower labor productivity and high input and logistic costs. Only in the case of leather goods can African firms in all countries compete on cost terms with China. And Tanzanian firms have a slight cost advantage over Chinese firms in the metal product cover. This table summarizes the cost differences distinguishing between the impact of labor productivity, input costs, and logistic costs between African firms and Chinese firms which are making a comparable product. In the case of Tanzania, the net effect of lower wage costs but a comparatively lower productivity and higher input and logistic costs resulted in making two product lines cost comparative with Chinese goods, namely leather, shoes, and wheat processing. And to summarize the paper, we assessed the economic efficiency and used a version of domestic resource cost indicator, which estimates the domestic resource at efficiency prices required to generate $1 of foreign exchange, either through import or export. As you can see, DCR is per unit domestic resource used in production, and we calculated by DR, which is domestic resource, times ER, which is exchange rate, and divided by FE, which is per unit foreign exchange effect. The DRC results show for 4 of the product lines. 2 of these were comparative at the time of a study, polo shirts and leather loafers, which are where DRC is smaller than 1. And wheat milling require only a very modest productivity improvement to be so. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, and for the good words. What I did, I was going to Morogoro. I was not driving the car, so having an extra person whom I could tap some wisdom from, to me was an advantage, so I didn't do anything special, but thanks so much. Good morning, everybody. I have a paper which is not purely manufacturing as the previous ones, but we are trying to demonstrate on the issues on leakage, but we are trying again to look at what kind of tourism product which can have more impact on local economic development. In this paper, I'll go briefly on the history of tourism, international tourism, Tanzania. I'll tell you a bit of Tanzania for those who have not been there, some very special endowment in tourism. I'll talk a bit on what's the contribution of tourism in the global economy, in Tanzania in particular, as the chair said. I'll talk a bit on the leakages, and then I'll demonstrate on the importance of community-based tourism as a proper option. And finally, I'll give a bit of a case study. I had prepared 2 case studies, but seeing what I saw yesterday, I know the time may not necessarily be enough, and you'll forgive me, I'll probably rush through some of the presentations. International tourism, if it's defined by traveling to another place where you are not residing for less than 1 year, you can see that the East African coast and even the hinterland had contact with various people from different places in the world for a long time, from ancient period, Chinese, Arabs, Greeks. So the history is full of the interaction with different people. And this again, unfortunately, apart from the ivory trade, there was slave trade. So we know this one. When the countries were colonized, you find that the settlers had to supplement their income with hunting, both ivory and skins. We know in history some very famous hunters who came to Tanzania, including Sir Churchill, Ted Roosevelt, and the famous Hemingway, and he wrote a novel based on the hunting he had done. But you remember when at least the Romanticism period, when the nature was being given a lot of weight. So when the Germans were in Tanzania, they started the conservation measures. Luckily, when the British took over, the conservation measures again were taken seriously. They started demarcating some land for national parks. And when the country got independence, there was a very moving quotation from Nyerere on, it's called the Nyerere's Arusha Manifesto, which committed the country that will make sure we preserve the nature so that our generation and generations to come can be able to enjoy. By so doing now, almost 1/3 of the country is on different form of land conservation. This is the highest in the world. As a result, we have 15 national parks, 28 game reserves, and all these others. So these conservation measures, apart from in conjunction with some endowment, you find in Tanzania, we can say it's a land of superlatives, where you have the highest mountain in Africa, you have the largest concentration of game reserves in the Serengeti, at least the Vai Gorge is known as a cradle of humankind. Ngorongoro Crater, for those who have been there, it's none of its kind. Zanzibar, you know, it's another place. Selous is the largest game reserve in the world. Lake Victoria, the second deepest, the second largest freshwater. Lake Tanganyika, second deepest, and probably even the friendliest people, isn't it? As a result of all these, you have a number of spectacular tourist attractions. For those who have not been in Ngorongoro, you can see one of the pictures. In Serengeti, the wild beast migration from Masai Mara to Serengeti is something you cannot experience anywhere else in the world. Mount Kilimanjaro, again, we said it was the highest. And everybody knows the rich man, Buffett. He was in Tanzania, I think a month ago. So in his street, he was jumping with Maasai people. So these are the issues which you can do. But apart from these issues which are taking place, there are a number of issues. Now, of course, we know during the Ujamaa period, a number of economic adventures were privatized. But now, everything in the value chain of tourism is practically run by the private sector, save for the regulations. But unfortunately, again, because of the demand of ivory in other countries, you find there is a huge problem of poaching. Before we know it, the population of the elephants is going down, and the other big fives are really being threatened. Again, because of the pressure of the increased population and the climate change, you find some of this land which is being under various forms of reserve. There's a competition, livestock, and other uses. As far as the contribution to the world economy, I'm glad the chair said this is one of the biggest sectors or industry, and this contribution comes from either direct, indirect, and induced economic activities. In Tanzania, again, specifically, one can say there are quite a number of the way the tourism contributes to the economy, foreign exchange, revenue, generation of employment, infrastructure, and definitely. So in Tanzania, if we can look on the growth of tourist arrivals, we can see we have had a positive trend over time. The aim was to have more than 1 million tourist arrivals in a year. We have already reached there. Now we are going to 1.5 million. In terms of receipts, saved that used to contribute significantly, but nowadays because of the gold and other mining products, you see the contribution is not as high. But again, there are so many issues when it comes to the exports from mining, because usually it's more statistics because the money doesn't come back. So still the tourism sector is quite important. And this graph here compares in the balance of payment data. If you compare the contribution of travel, which here sums the tourism and the travel together, as compared to the total service earning, you can see at least is one of the major contributors in that area. This is the value chain mapping when it comes to tourism in Tanzania. Now, we said there are quite a number of positive contributions of tourism, but you find there are quite a number of negative impacts of tourism, where this paper will talk more about leakages, but the other are still some negative economic impacts, but this one deals with the leakage. When the leakage, we talk about financial leakage because not all the money which is generated by the sector stays in the destination country. Much of it is leaked back to other countries because of trying to service the tourism. You find there are quite a number of studies which have indicated that the leakage may average between 60 and 70, but there are some cases where it goes up to 90%. But compared to the conventional tourism, where it's more based on the 5 S's, safari, sun, sand, sea, and the other S I don't like to say here, you find there could be, and there is actually, a product which can have more impact in the rural economy. And this is more of a sustainable tourism or community-based tourism or cultural tourism, which you find this is a special niche and a special product where in communities, members of the communities are involved much more to guide the tourists, and at least the tourists are become part and parcel of that community in that time. So you find there is more linkages. And in this case here, there is a diagram which shows on how the local communities, this one is more particularly better, how local communities or local economy can benefit more from that kind of tourism. In Tanzania, there is a specific product under cultural tourism program, and which there are quite a number of communities, up to 47 now, but which in a way they have been designed, and some of the tourists, like 10% of them, international ones, it's an add-on product where they can go to Serengeti, they can go to Ngorongoro, they can go to Zanzibar, but eventually they take some time to go to some of these community-based tourist products. And here you find basically the communities, they benefit more than the conventional. If you go and stay at the beach hotel, there's so much leakage, but when you go to the villages and you let be guided by the local girls and boys, and you eat some local food, stay in some communities, hotels there, at least that one, through the multiplier effect as well, as we'll see soon, there the local communities are more likely to benefit. There are quite a number of principles and which are guiding this community-based tourism. Most of them are common sense, but we think that for this to be more sustainable, at least there are quite a number of issues which have to be taken care of. One is the quality of employment, environmental purity, it shouldn't destroy environment, social equity, people should be concerned with how they interact with their counterparts in the village. Of course, the visitors should be fulfilled to at least to enjoy the product, the principles, at least the guiding should be done by the locals, and all these kind of things. So these are the principles. I said I'm going to demonstrate this one using one of the cases in Lushoto, which is in the Tanga region. This is one of the very successful community-based tourism program. You find in this area there is this group called Friends of Usambara Society, which aims at promoting sustainable tourism in these mountains, Usambara, and contribute to the conservation of the area. And it's one of the 6 tour guide groups in Lushoto. In 2006, fortunately, this is the area where I did my PhD. There were only this one. But now, because of the increased volume of business, 5 other groups have joined, and you find that quite of, at least a number of tourists have increased. In terms of, this is the office of Friends of Usambara. Luckily, I was there in two weeks ago. I met some of the colleagues I had worked with in 2003, 2004, 2005. I was glad to be back. So in terms of stakeholders, you find there are a lot of stakeholders when it comes to this community-based tourism in Lushoto in particular. Here you have the government, you have the service providers, the local hotels, you have bus bus services, and the villages where the products are. So you find there are quite a number of stakeholders involved. What they do is when you go, they charge you to take you to some of the attractions. In that charge, they get some portion which they call Village Development Fund. What they do, they provide some services to, like water, to some of the villages. I was lucky to be given the, because this is a well-established group, they put up in open their accounts. These are the accounts of the first quarter of this year. As you can see, for a group of like 10 people earning 11 million in a quarter and devoting close to 7 million to Village Development Fund. Yes, thank you. It's kind of quite substantial. And bearing in mind that statistics have indicated, as let's say a number of studies have indicated that the multiplier effect from tourism can go up to 3.2 rather. So you find in this community, during low season, people will be feeling jittery because they have no activities. They are quite like the local hotels will not have sufficient business. These tour guides, they do not have a lot to do. So when the season picks up, you find everybody is quite happy. So we can say that the types of tourism products, which indeed are integrated with the local communities. And despite the fact that we talked about the leakages, if you take about the retained earning of which is coming from the tourism sector, it is substantial given that there are in some communities there aren't so many diversified economic activities. This is one of the major economic activities. As I said, during the low season, you find there's at least a depression in terms of demand of goods and services. And when the season picks up, you find people are quite busy and definitely happy. So what we can conclude, there was this Sandbrook who did a study in Uganda and indicated that actually the retained earning from tourism, local tourism, is quite essential in local economic development because there are no, in some societies, there are no viable other economic activities, so this is one. So if with a minimal financial leakages, this multiplier effect in local economy, it is quite a substantial activity, and particularly if it is added on in terms of diversified kind of employment opportunity, and as it links with the local other suppliers in the agriculture for that matter. So if the 12 principles of community-based tourism are upheld, then we can at least be sure that there will be sustainability of this community-based tourism. Mr. Chairman, I hope you have been kind, but at least this is what I had. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael McGowan. I'm on the board of the Centre for African Studies at Leeds University. The clarification is more of a clarification of the overall picture. I found the whole presentation really interesting, and it seems to be a story of fairly poor industrial development, fairly slow, not substantial, but increasing. I believe it was mentioned sharply by Lance fairly recently. I'd like to sort of have some clarification on this, but my interest is particularly to what extent this has affected the quality of life in the local community. The last presentation was very specific about the importance of this. And it's just that there's very much of a dominance at the seminar on data and the analysis of data. And I'm quite interested to know who collects all this data. Are we talking about academics or civil servants? Because the data is sometimes referred to as though it's almost biblical, you know. And I was very interested when Brian, at the very beginning of the session, said that if you really want to know what's really happening, like the quality of life in the local community, get someone in a car or take them for a walk, rather than be analysing sort of the data. Thank you.
Can I add a postscript to that question? Does the data include the informal sector? And if it does, do you believe the figures? Right. Any other clarifications? Yes.
Thank you, Mike Lofty. A quick clarification question for...
Just, I know we know who you are, but just do say.
So a quick clarification question for Faustin that continues the conversation we were having at breakfast this morning about the impressive, very 18% contribution by tourism to the country's forex earnings. One understands also that the tourism sector has very high foreign exchange costs. Vehicles, including aircraft that fly domestic routes, fuel, the luxury inputs that the tourist requires, alcoholic beverages, and so on for tourists. Would it be possible on the basis of available data to recalculate a net contribution of tourism to the country's forex earnings?
Thank you. That was Michael Lofty. Any other clarification questions? Otherwise, they're pretty important. We'll just let the speakers respond to those. Please.
Data. Yeah, taking the queries from the last one to the first. The data on manufacturing is enterprises employing 10 or more people. So I suspect that counts out the informal sector. And I don't believe a lot of it anyway. I mean, I find the data very hard to take absolute seriously, certainly not biblically. And I've had, just assembling data is hard enough. Because even if you go to the World Bank prides itself on its World Data Bank, but there are lots of gaps. And those gaps are there because they don't believe the data that they're getting from the countries, which are getting them from their data collection agencies. So these are public employees, essentially. And the regular surveys that they do, and a lot of data are simply estimates. So, yes, I mean, it is true that if you want to get a much better idea of what's going on, then you should go there. And even then, you're not going to get a very good idea. And it's always seemed to me as a sort of economist. I mean, I was trained as an economist, but I increasingly dislike economics as I get older. I always thought anthropology was a much more important discipline, because at least that meant people, and there is industrial anthropology. And at least there were people who actually went to work, went to be participants as observers, and get a much clearer idea from the point of view of the people themselves. But when you're far distant but you're still interested and you want to know what's going on, you have to take the data you've got, and we have to hope that it is consistently inconsistent, which is always something I've always hoped that data is. So at least it gives you the right trends, even if you don't have the absolute correct information.
Ronak.
Yes, the data that was used mostly in the paper that I presented was gathered from World Bank. As just he mentioned, I don't believe in data that much, but the paper was based on secondary data, and I do believe that it should be data, because when you just see people, it's just a very, very small sample of people that you are seeing them. And you can't judge the country with just a group of people, or qualitative methods is limited to a smaller sample. But with larger sample, we can use the data, secondary data, which has been gathered through World Bank or any other resources. And I'm still very young, and I'm trained as economist, so still I do believe in data.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. On that question is quite relevant. Again, on the aspect of some of these data, again, you find most of the data cited on the contribution of tourism in the economy. Actually, they're coming from sort of a self-reporting World Travel and Tourism Council. They have a fantastic way of packaging their materials, and so whether you believe them or not, that's another matter. Unfortunately, because the tourism sector is complex, dealing with so many players in the value chain, there is a new, not necessarily new, but at least there is a system of accounting, tourism satellite accounting, which is very complex, needing input-output tables. And in Tanzania, I'll tell you, for the past 10 years, there has been a project on converting that, at least using the TCA, the tourism satellite accounting, to be able to present its data. Unfortunately, that project has not come to the end because of the complexity and the sources of data. So this data, as I said, is self-reporting by the World Travel and Tourism Council. So the issue, whether you believe them or not, that's another matter, because there isn't much, there isn't any other source to verify on the truth of this, and to a certain degree, because other data have indicated there's so much leakage, as you have indicated. Probably this would be the gross, the 18% would be gross, and if you take the average leakage to be like between 60 and 70, then probably the net effect would be at least times 0.7 or 0.6. That would be probably the money which remains in the country. But it's a very complex industry, and the computation, to be realistic, there are a lot of issues which need to be considered. Thank you.
So both the industrial papers are based on secondary data. So we weren't really able to answer the question of what it feels like on the ground. I wonder if there's anybody in the audience who could give an answer to that question, has some experience of what, if you like, this type of manufacturing, or indeed tourism, feels like on the ground.
I'm Anthony Ellman. I can talk about tourism on the ground. I think Faustin's presentation and the emphasis on community-based tourism is very attractive. It certainly benefits the local population much more than the high-end tourism and the large resorts where tourists are cut off in an enclave. I've done work in Zanzibar studying the impact of tourism on local communities and looking at opportunities for linking small farmer groups to the tourist hotels and restaurants and enabling them to produce food, fruit and vegetables, dairy products, eggs and so on to supply the hotels. And the reality is that there is a lot of resentment, more on Zanzibar I think than in mainland Tanzania, because most of the employees in the high-end tourist hotels are not Zanzibaris, they're Kenyans or mainland Tanzanians, because Zanzibaris don't want to serve alcohol and pork and bacon and so on to the tourists, but also because the hotels, there's a lot of resentment that the hotels are taking the bulk of water supplies, depriving villages of their water supplies, of their access to the beaches where they've traditionally repaired their fishing nets and so on. So there have been cases of suspected arson, villages burning down tourist hotels, or there's one generator which was burnt and it hasn't been proven, but high suspicion of arson. So I think that the tourist board really needs to do much more, it seemed to me, from what Zanzibaris were saying, to ensure more local content of the food and the handicrafts as well, mostly imported from Kenya or India, not from Tanzania. So this is a view that I got from the ground, on the ground in Zanzibar.
Right, I saw one other hand.
Thanks. My name is Dan Brockington from the University of Manchester. It's partly an observation, and it's related to the tourism industry. It's also a question. And the observation is that, as Anthony's just said, there are some forms of conservation which have considerable local cost. Protected areas are established requiring the displacement either physically of people from their homes or the economic displacement. They can't herd there, gather fuel there, or cultivate agriculture there. And there are well-known costs associated with protected areas which were not part of the costs that were listed in Faustin's presentation. The question is what sort of landscape, protected area landscape, might be more congenial to community-based tourism? I think you're quite right that community-based tourism will have more local multiplier effects, but I can't see community-based tourist operators operating very effectively in the middle, for example, of the Serengeti or in the middle of the Selous Game Reserve. And I think you might have very different sorts of landscapes like you find on top of the Mzumbaras, which would be congenial to these sorts of local multiplier effects.
I've seen one more. I'll take one more. Then we'll let this panel respond to the three. Brian.
I actually withdraw my point because I want to talk about industry, and this seems to be an interesting discussion developing about tourism. So I suggest that discussion continues, and I come in later about industry.
Okay.
I'd like to ask something about tourism. It's David Potts at University of Bradford. Questions here. First of all, how do you promote community tourism to villages? Secondly, how do you get tourists to go on this kind of community? I can say that I've experienced one of these things in the Mzumbaras, but I went there through word of mouth. How do we get that knowledge to the tourism so this kind of alternative is there? And thirdly, how do you avoid potential negative cultural influences of tourists who are not very sensitive to the environment they're working in, or that they're working, that they are going to?
Right, well, we'll let Faustin respond to these three questions, and the others if they want to.
Yeah, thank you so much. With the comments from Anton, I think you have supplemented a number of issues which we have probably done in the presentation, but because of the time, some of them were not touched. I understand, yes, it's true, in Zanzibar, there are those sensitivities when it comes to the sector. And of course, there are quite a number of other negative issues which probably have not been said. With Dan on the landscape which would be appropriate for the community-based tourism, I believe even if it is Serengeti where you have safari, what you have said, this is an add-on product. People or the tourists can still go to Serengeti in the Land Cruisers and Land Rovers, but if they wish, they can drop by some of the close by villages where they can still undertake the community-based tourism. You know, that's actually some of the products, some of the villages which are implementing this, the surrounding either Ngorongoro or Serengeti, where some of the visitors, before they come back, they would wish to go and taste how our Maasai friends live. And by so doing, if they are to spend a day or two in that kind of environment, that's why we find at least the communities might enjoy better. So it's not a standalone product as such. People can still go to Zanzibar on the beach, but you supplement with another activity of knowing and just interacting with people rather than just staying in the Land Cruiser and just maybe sleeping on the beach only. Now, some pertinent questions from our colleague David. There are quite a number of ways which the community-based tourism can be promoted, at least in Tanzania, the way it has been promoted. The tourism board, in its advertisements, they include this product. So at least if you consume their advertisements, you can still get the information. But as you put it, the word of mouth is so powerful. And mostly, for those who have been in Lushoto, for those who have been in some of these products, in Longido or whatever, if they tell their colleagues, actually that is the most credible source, because this is very sensitive. Unless you have seen somebody of your kind who tells you it is safe, don't worry. It's when people go there in much confidence. But otherwise, with the development of information technology, you find a number of these have their Facebook pages. They have some websites. So when you are searching about a place to visit in Tanzania, you are most likely to see some of the sites. How do you convince people to go? Again, the word of mouth is very important, but in the road show and any other advertisements, this is included. And probably even writing about it and talking about it in this kind of conference is another way of letting people know about it. And we'll be glad if you post this one on your website as well. I'm sure some people can just get some information about some of these products. Avoiding the negative cultural influence. That one is a catch, because as much as some of the visitors are sensitive to locals, there are some which have this area of superiority, knowing what I do is the best, so others don't matter. So that is a very sensitive place. But in the local, in this community-based tourism, because you are going to be guided by the local guards, it's easier for normal people to be told probably the way you have dressed, where we are going, may not necessarily be the best. So for normal people, they can, because of the interaction of the local guides rather, it is easier to try to convert one. But I'm sure you can only minimize. You cannot eliminate it in a certain way. In a certain way, it's a danger. You open up yourself. If you are interacting with the outside world, you may be affected, and you may affect them in some sort. But at least from the areas we have worked with, so far so good, save that this type of tourism, again, just like any other type of tourism, it creates a bit of dependence, in the sense that the some of the people who have taken it so easy to pose photos with tourists and maybe get required to be paid and something, which is a bit demeaning, but sometimes some of these negatives, as we said, we can only minimize them. There's no way we can eliminate them. Thank you.
Have any of you anything to say about this issue of either the issue of foreign exchange content of tourism or the issue of the relationship of tourism to local communities and resentment of the type described in Zanzibar on basis of some visits?
I'm going to make one brief comment, but I want to come back to industry as well. So I don't know why I should both
Let's
together.
just see, on the foreign exchange content, for example.
Well, this isn't something I've thought about deeply, but I do. It just reminds me of the kind of debates that went on in Dar es Salaam in the late 60s and early 70s about tourism and about its role in economic development, and whether and again it goes back to the story of industrialization. Tourism is something that comes afterwards, or something that is seen as some kind of engine of development, and then that relates to obviously the difficulties of the foreign exchange content of tourism. How much of when you're building the big hotels, it's very clear that there's a lot of foreign exchange content. Clearly, with community tourism, it's something else, and it does seem to me that is a way of domesticizing tourism. And if you can train your tourists to start with, then and it's very likely to be those kinds of, you're going to get those kind of tourists. It's almost a self-fulfilling process that you're going to get the kind of tourists that you want in those situations. People who are a bit more sensitive, people who've got. You're not going to get the Hemingways as long as you're not offering hunting, but you're going to get people who are actually interested in the communities and in making those links, and so that seems to be the obvious way to go.
Mine was just a quick question, and coming from a peace studies sort of background, I wanted to whether you could comment, especially on the impact of or to what extent. I don't know whether that has come across. Thank you.
Right, let's take that question and then go on to the industrial sector. Otherwise, we're not giving a fair discussion to that. So let's just let Faustin respond to the two relatively simple, straightforward questions that we've got there.
Yeah, thank you, my sister. About the impact of terrorism, I know one of the very sensitive industries, tourism is one, and in fact there's a danger if you depend so much on tourism. The shock, particularly the one to do with peace and tranquility, it can cut off almost every expected income, and Kenya for sure has been one of the victims. If you go now in Mombasa, most of the hotels actually they don't have a lot of visitors. Whereas, in a certain way, but again, I'm not having a lot of data on this one. Looks like what is happening in Kenya is probably this is an unintended consequence, by the way. It looks like Tanzania could be not necessarily beneficiary, but an alternative. So at least if you look at the number of arrivals, the earnings, Tanzania seems not to be suffering as much. But as I said, it's a very sensitive industry. If next day something was to happen in Tanzania, it has happened in Zanzibar for some time when there have been some few incidences of breach of peace and tranquility. But at least in the mainland, things have not been so bad. About the second question, maybe I didn't get you, but what because of the conventional tourism, they package it whereby people like the people traveling group, they pay in their source country or the origin, and they travel in groups, and everything is already prepared on the arrival. That has less and less impact, at least in the local economy. But this one, if it is low impact, people traveling sometimes alone, even you find even the backpackers, actually they could have, even though the backpackers don't have a lot of money, but because they are most likely to go and stay in some of these products, they might have even better impact than like those who are coming in the cruise. Everything is paid in the cruise. They go probably on the port just to walk. They don't probably buy anything. So you find in that case the number of arrivals, would say there are so much, but probably the local communities or even the local economies may not necessarily benefit so much. But we can discuss later when we finish this one. Thank you.
We are running out of time, but we'll take three, I hope, quick questions on the industrial side. I've seen it. Yes, Brian first.
Well, I will make 3 points. I try and be quick. I'm Brian Van Arken, if that's not yet obvious. But I make quick points. One, relating the tourism, indigenous income, and industrialization question, it turns out that in terms of household income, a very important source of household income, particularly for women, is local brewing. And I just comment that it's almost impossible for tourists, or even non-tourists, to get easy access to local booze. And given the fact that one thing many tourists like to do is precisely to booze, that seems to be unfortunate.
And it probably doesn't come in the statistics either, does it, Brad?
No. And I relate that also to a question I don't want Faustin to answer now, but I like to think about, is how would you get tourists to go to his own area? And we'll talk about that later separately. But then on the mainstream of the industrial papers, the weakness of this sort of statistical approach and this sort of data approach, and even the main weakness, I think, of those of us who wrote and thought about industrialization, is it doesn't address the question of who are the actors, who are the industrialists, who do we expect to do this? And the intervention that Lawrence made yesterday, for example, in Tanzania is critical. The effect of nationalization of housing was not felt in Tanzania so much in the housing market, but in fact in industrial investment, because at that point the critical players in Tanzania were the Asian community. And indeed, when I did a report in '89 on Vietnam, the critical thought I had, and I was quite right, and I wrote about that, was that Vietnam was going to benefit from its location, because of its access to a large number of regional industrialists who were facing rising wage rates and were therefore interested in finding new sites. So I think one weakness which one has to transcend in this analysis is addressing very directly who you expect to be the industrialists, because they are, after all, to some degree, sort of Schumpeterian entrepreneurs. They're people who are doing new things, and you have to find out who they are, who potentially they could be. A second point, which is just a small empirical observation for those of you working on the Tanzanian data, is my belief, and it'd be interesting to get someone to test it, is that in the 90s there was a revival of industrial activity in quite a big way, and it was really gathering momentum. And then it was checked by infrastructural constraints, particularly electricity supply, also water, and even transport bottlenecks. And all these things now still operate very much. And so I think in talking, in analysing what actually happened on the ground, that should be quite a part of the discussion. And it is, for example, a contrast between Tanzania and Vietnam, a sort of perhaps global mean. Because the Vietnamese have actually been quite clever and energetic in handling infrastructural issues, and Tanzania has lamentably not been very effective.
Lawrence.
I just want to speak briefly or comment briefly in relation to the textile manufacturing sector in Tanzania. And I appreciated very much Ronak's comparative cost figures. I should explain, Chairman, that to those who are unaware, that I've been associated with the Gatsby Foundation and Tanzania Gatsby Trust for a long time. And during the last 7 or 8 years, we have done a lot of work in the textile manufacturing sector as well as in cotton. And Dr. Pami Sinha at the back initially was one of the people involved in that. But in relation to this conversation, I just want to say that in spite of the cost comparison figures which one can generate, there is in fact a huge discrepancy between the most successful textile company in Tanzania, which is A to Z in Arusha, and the much less successful, very small ones who are churning out Kangro and Kitenge cloth in Dar es Salaam in a very inefficient way, which is apparently appropriate for the market, but actually is not very appropriate. And I would say the Ministry of Commerce and Industry has really failed to intervene in an effective way in that sector, although the opportunities are huge. But one has to differentiate in this garment manufacturing, and Ronak's figures referred to polo shirts and spinning and weaving. And garment manufacturing has a huge opportunity under AGOA in the US market, which Kenya successfully took advantage of. And Tanzania has not really succeeded, with the exception of this company called A to Z in really cashing in on. So there is a huge discrepancy. There's plenty of opportunity. But as Brian says, the main constraint actually is not the fact, not issues to do with wages. The main constraint is energy. And any one of these manufacturing operations will tell you that their main problem is having to suspend operations for 4 or 5 hours a day. In many cases, it is a huge issue, which tends to be tremendously underrated in the discussion of these questions.
A last quick point anybody want? If not, as time is not on our side, we'll invite the speakers. And I think with Ronak, there's some really addressed to you there.
Actually, it wasn't my paper, it was my supervisor paper, but I did the presentation. But I think I mentioned that the reason that Tanzania can't, Sub-Saharan African, they can't break into export markets through manufactured, it doesn't lie in their wages. It's because of the lack of institutions, quality of institutions that they're suffering from it. And I said we can explain the low share of manufacturing in GDP and export through different channels, which is poor infrastructure, even Dutch's disease, the lack of skills. It doesn't do anything with the low wages in Tanzania. We can't blame wages in Tanzania for not being successful in manufacturing. I don't know if I address your question on that.
Peter. Actually, it was a comment. Yes, who are the actors? And that's part of a question of the role of the state in industrial strategy, is identifying. It's precisely having the ability to be able to identify those actors. And in the paper I did actually talk about the absence of your traditional capitalist class, the role the state was supposed to play to substitute for that, at least over the short run, and then the fact that with privatization and sometimes the disappearance of enterprises, you still don't have the state. We don't have a kind of state that gives you the ability to be able to identify who the actors are and then support those actors once you've identified them. I mean, there are a whole lot of issues about industrial strategy I didn't talk about. I mean, there is the whole question of what is the strategy in terms of the industries you choose and the manufacturing you choose to support. Is it a repeat of everywhere else, or is it an anticipation of what might be the thing to go for in the future, what might be successful in the future. So there are a whole lot of issues. And one of the things also, finally, we haven't really talked about at all is the international context in which countries like Tanzania find themselves. And this is maybe there should have been a session in the conference on the role. There'll be something on the financial crisis, but it's very specific. There should be something on the effects of all of these, of the place that Tanzania has in the international system.
Yes, it was just beginning to come up in some of Lawrence's questions about the international role, but also the opportunities to export into the further inside Africa. But Faustin,
The last one.
final wind up.
Thank you, Brian. Just answer one. I think you are very right that people travel to drink some, and I would say that there are two types of.
Mention what else they're doing.
There are two types of local booze. There is local and the local. So I know David, when he comes to Tanzania, he likes his safari, which is local in a way, but he doesn't take that local. So to me, I think the local beers in Tanzania, Safari, Serengeti, and the others are part of the entertainment.
What about the Busi?
That is the local one. No, that's difficult. So the other one we'll discuss between us. Thank you so much.
Right, on that happy note, we will conclude the session. And thank everybody for their participation. And I think we can probably start on time again at 11 o'clock. David, is there anything you want to say?
I better not. Let's have some coffee.
No, coffee, everybody. Back at 11.